At 5:17 a.m., in international waters of the Caribbean Sea, a Venezuelan patrol boat made a disastrous miscalculation. Without warning, it opened fire. Its 76mm deck guns shattered the silence of the pre-dawn mist. What the crew did not realize was that just 18 seconds later, they were about to learn a harsh lesson from the U.S. Navy. That reckless decision would do more than ignite a dangerous standoff at sea. It would also trigger a tense 48-hour ultimatum from President Trump. But this crisis did not come out of nowhere. It was the final stage of a plan that had been building for weeks. Venezuela believed it held the advantage. The maze of rocky islands across the region, combined with cheap disposable drones, seemed to offer the perfect cover for pressuring U.S. patrols without paying a price. What they failed to account for was the power of the Aegis combat system and the watchful reach of the P-8 Poseidon. This was not just another stretch of Caribbean water with calm blue waves and white beaches. It was one of the most critical corridors in the illegal drug trade. Roughly 90% of the cocaine entering the United States moves through this region, more than 1,000 tons every year. Venezuela understood that well, and it used the islands and the violent sea currents as a natural shield. It was a clever defense, but not a flawless one. At this strategic choke point, Venezuela took a serious gamble. On paper, the mission looked almost impossible for the United States. The Venezuelans knew the terrain, could launch drone swarm tactics at short notice, and operated in waters where powerful Caribbean currents could distort radar signals. So how does the U.S. Navy counter swarm tactics and electronic interference? How do you fight an opponent you cannot see clearly? The first move in this high-stakes contest did not come from a warship. It came from a converted Boeing 737, flying patiently at 30,000 feet far beyond the horizon. That aircraft was the P-8A Poseidon, the U.S. Navy's premier maritime surveillance hunter sent to sort through a tangled mix of traffickers, patrol craft, and rising hostility at sea. You do not send a hammer first, you send a surgeon. Why the P-8? Because everything about it was built around one principle: mastering the physics of looking down. Its most important weapon was not a missile, but the AN/APY-10 multi-mission radar mounted beneath its nose. Think of it less as a basic radar sweep and more as a high-powered scanner for the ocean's surface. For this mission, its greatest advantage was synthetic aperture radar. It did not just detect a dot on a screen. It captured thousands of radar snapshots every second as the aircraft moved, then used powerful processing to combine them into an image with near photographic detail. That is how an operator, working calmly from inside the aircraft, could distinguish the radar signature of a 200 to 500-ton Venezuelan patrol boat from that of a 3,000-ton civilian freighter from 150 miles away. The entire process was a masterclass in integrated warfare. As the P-8's radar mapped the battle space, its sensor operators identified and tagged potential threats. That information, including position, course, speed, and a high-detail radar image, was compressed and sent through Link 16, the military's secure, encrypted battlefield network. From the aircraft, the signal moved to a satellite, and from there, straight into the Combat Information Center aboard USS Gravely. There, it does not arrive as a voice report that someone has to write down. It appears automatically on the main display of the Aegis combat system as a hostile contact, complete with every piece of data the P-8 has just collected. The Venezuelan crew has no idea that their vessel has already been identified, classified, and locked into the system before they have even finished their morning coffee. But the P-8 has one important weakness. At the end of the day, it is still a 737. It is large, noisy, and about as discreet as a flying school bus. That is exactly why it operates from a standoff distance, staying just outside the engagement range of Venezuela's coastal air defenses. It is a carefully managed risk. Its extraordinary surveillance power is balanced by very real physical vulnerability. So it keeps circling, the unseen eye in the sky, watching as the Venezuelans sail with confidence toward a trap that had been prepared for them hours earlier. Then the Venezuelan captain gave the order. Fuego! The command sliced through the pre-dawn silence. This was the moment they had been building toward, the payoff for their high-risk gamble. Their entire strategy depended on dragging the fight into point-blank range. Their weapon of choice, the Otto Melara 76mm gun, was not designed to act like a precision rifle. It was built to behave more like a brutal close-range blaster, flooding a target with speed, metal, and explosive force. Its purpose was simple: tear across an enemy's deck, smash radar antennas, and overwhelm exposed personnel with a torrent of up to 100 high-explosive rounds per minute. Their doctrine demanded proximity. They needed to get close enough to see the rust on the enemy's hull, land a punishing opening strike, and then disappear back into the maze of islands before the larger force could respond. It was a classic tactic for a smaller, more agile navy, fast, aggressive, and built on surprise. But the entire plan rested on one critical and fatal assumption: that their approach had gone unnoticed. They believed they were the hunters setting the ambush. They had no idea they were the ones who had already walked into it. The American response was quiet, digital, and almost contemptuous in its efficiency. Inside Gravely's Combat Information Center, there was no panic. There was only procedure. The first layer of defense was not a weapon at all. It was a tactic, a kind of electronic hide-and-seek. The destroyer's AN/SLQ 32 electronic warfare suite, known as Sidekick, came alive. This was the ship's specialist in deception. Gravely first shifted into emissions control, reducing its own radar signature until its 9,000-ton frame looked electronically more like a small fishing vessel than a guided missile destroyer. Then, Sidekick began its real work. Digital spoofing. It pushed multiple false radar returns into the battlespace, creating phantom contacts across the surface picture. Ghost ships, false targets, empty patches of ocean dressed up as something worth shooting at. The Venezuelan gunners, believing they were engaging a real opponent, began wasting precious ammunition on illusions. And while they were busy chasing phantoms, the real danger posed by their incoming 76mm rounds was already being handled. That was the job of the RIM-162 Evolved Sea Sparrow missile, the ESSM. It was not an offensive strike weapon. It was a guardian, built to intercept danger before it could reach the ship. Its method was brutally precise. The incoming round was tracked by the Aegis system, which calculated a projected intercept point in three-dimensional space. The ESSM was then launched, not toward where the shell was, but toward where the system predicted it would be. In the final seconds, the missile's own seeker took over, making tiny corrections at extreme speed as it pulled maneuvers of up to 50 Gs. Turns so violent they would crush a human pilot, all to ensure the interception. This was the real difference between the two sides. The Venezuelans were still fighting a close-range gunnery duel. The Americans were fighting a networked, layered, machine-speed battle that had already advanced several moves ahead. To the Venezuelan crew, it probably felt like chaos. Their targets seemed to shrink, blur, and multiply. Radar returns became unreliable. Shots were spent on echoes. And before they could even understand what was happening, the defensive shield around Gravely was already in motion. That is what made the trap so effective. It was not built on brute force alone. It was built on awareness. The P-8 saw the board first. Aegis organized it. Sidekick distorted it. And the ESSM stood ready to erase anything that still made it through. By the time the Venezuelan captain believed he was launching the first real blow, the engagement had already shifted beyond anything his crew could control. They were not dictating the battle. They were reacting inside a system designed to confuse, outpace, and neutralize them before their advantage at close range could ever matter. What they thought would be a quick strike from the cover of the islands was turning into something else entirely, a demonstration of what happens when an old doctrine built on surprise collides with a modern kill chain built on sensors, data links, deception, and speed. And the most dangerous part for them was this: the Americans still had not shown their full hand. It was the ultimate defensive shortstop, knocking Venezuelan shells out of the sky with cold, automated precision. The Venezuelans believed they were stepping into a knife fight. The Americans had just shown they were not even fighting on the same level. And just as Gravely's crew was methodically breaking apart the first wave of the attack, the battle space changed again. This was Venezuela's hidden card, a far more sophisticated move than simple brute force. From a concealed coastal position, a Russian-made Buk M2E system, likely supported by foreign advisors, came online. It did not launch a missile. Instead, it created a powerful localized bubble of GPS jamming. In an instant, the precision-guided world the U.S. Navy depended on became blurred and uncertain. At the same time, a new danger appeared on radar, moving fast. Not a single contact, but dozens. A swarm of cheap commercial drones, each likely carrying a small explosive payload, had launched from the nearby islands. It was a classic swarm tactic, but with a clever twist. The drones were not the real danger, they were the distraction. Their job was to force Gravely to focus its formidable defenses, its CIWS and ESSM, on a mass of cheap incoming targets. They were the Matador's cape, meant to hold the bull's attention while the real threat, the coastal jamming system, prepared to do the real damage. A countdown appeared on Gravely's main display, 90 seconds. That was how long remained before the drone swarm reached the ship and its GPS-guided weapons were forced to operate in a degraded environment. Venezuela had built a remarkably effective trap. Jamming combined with a drone swarm, a textbook anti-access, area denial problem designed to strip a modern warship of its technological edge. But they made one fundamental mistake. They assumed the fight ended at the horizon. The American answer came from somewhere the Venezuelans could neither see nor reach. Gravely executed a flawless maneuver that, on Venezuelan radar, looked like a withdrawal. It was bait. As the patrol boat and its drone swarm pushed forward with growing confidence, they moved farther from the protective cover of their own coastal jamming umbrella. It was a classic rope-a-dope. Then the hammer came down. The order was not to fire an anti-drone weapon, it was to launch the SM-2, the Standard Missile-2. This was the long-range sword of the Aegis system. If the ESSM was a fencer's foil for close defense, the SM-2 was a 9-foot claymore built for combat far beyond visual range. And how did it work in a jammed environment? It did not need GPS. The SM-2 launched using inertial guidance, relying on an advanced internal system of gyroscopes and accelerometers that allowed it to understand its position in space without any outside signal. For most of its 90 nautical mile flight, it traveled by dead reckoning, receiving only occasional course updates from Gravely's powerful SPY-1 radar. Only in the final phase did its own radar seeker activate and lock onto the target. This was a weapon built for exactly this kind of electronic warfare. Then a calm voice cut through the Combat Information Center. False retreat complete. Come about. Engage targets. The battle had changed once again. This was no longer a coastal knife fight. It had become something far more dangerous, a long-range networked duel in which one side was still trying to force close-quarters chaos, while the other was calmly reshaping the entire fight from a distance. It had become a deep-water takedown. This was no longer just an exchange of fire. It was a symphony directed by the Aegis combat system. The SM-2 missiles launched from beyond the horizon were the lead instruments. On the main display inside Gravely's Combat Information Center, their icons raced across the map. Their routes were calculated not simply for speed, but for timing. This was the craft of a time-on-target strike, where multiple weapons launched at different moments and from different positions are synchronized to arrive in the same instant. It was the naval version of checkmate delivered from three sides of the board at once. As the missiles entered their terminal dive, a final countdown appeared on the screen. 10, 9, 8. This was the moment when physics, data, and decades of training came together in a single, unavoidable result. The first SM-2 was not aimed at Gary's waterline. That would have been too blunt. Its target was a 3-foot square section of the superstructure that housed the ship's main fire control radar. The missile's proximity fuse triggered its high-explosive fragmentation warhead at exactly the right moment, only meters above the target. The blast was not intended to sink the vessel. It was meant to shut it down. Thousands of preformed tungsten fragments tore through the fragile radar arrays and communication antennas, instantly blinding the Venezuelan ship and cutting its link to command. This was the logic of effects-based targeting. The objective was not total destruction, but neutralization. By stripping the ship of its ability to fight, the U.S. Navy could contain the confrontation while still achieving its military goal. But a follow-up battle damage assessment from the P-8's high-resolution camera showed that a secondary system was still operating. The order went out for a second strike. This one was different. It was aimed at the engine room. This was no longer a warning. It was the final full stop at the end of the sentence. The second missile struck with overwhelming force. Its kinetic energy punched through the thin hull before the warhead detonated inside the engine compartment. Guerri was torn apart from within. Yet even as the ship was breaking down, the Venezuelan trap had one last threat to offer. The surviving drones from the original swarm, with their controllers now gone, continued along their last programmed course, a blind final charge. This was exactly the moment the Phalanx Close-In Weapon System, or CIWS, was built for. It was the ship's final shield, a fully autonomous guardian. There is a reason sailors call it R2D2, with a Gatling gun. Its integrated search and track radar picked up the incoming drones, identified them as immediate threats, and generated firing solutions without waiting for a single human command. Then came the unmistakable mechanical roar of its 20mm Vulcan cannon as it unleashed a stream of tungsten rounds, building a dense barrier of fire that tore through the drones one after another. In a matter of moments, the last wave was gone. The fight was over. The sinking of the vessel was a tactical success, but the larger victory was measured far from the Caribbean, in intelligence briefings and logistics reports back in Washington. First came the supply chain effect. By taking a key patrol ship out of the equation, the U.S. Navy had done more than win a confrontation at sea. It had opened a gap in one of the regime's most important protection networks, choking the flow of cocaine for a time and disrupting a major source of revenue. Second came the psychological blow. The speed and precision of the American response sent a shock through the Venezuelan military command. Their most carefully prepared coastal trap, built around geography, deception, and home field advantage, had been dismantled with clinical efficiency. Confidence dropped, morale followed. So what was the real lesson from that night in the dark waters of the Caribbean? Venezuela made a classic mistake. It confused tactical aggression with strategic power. It believed boldness, surprise, and local advantage would be enough. What it discovered instead was far more painful. Initiative means very little when the other side sees farther, thinks faster, and controls the pace of the fight. They believed they were entering a contest of nerve and proximity. What they actually stepped into was a system built to outmatch them at every level. And that leaves the final question. What if Venezuela had chosen not to step back? Would this overwhelming response still have been the right move, or might a different strategy have changed the outcome?